Hello people of the internet, this is Shaky Jake, and I really need a catchphrase. These past few weeks have been rather interesting. I made one video response which completely exceeded any expectations and it got way more attention than I ever expected. To anyone who liked or disliked the video, commented on it, or even subscribed to my channel since, I thank you all very much. Except for some of the more trollish comments, those people can do one. There are a few things that were not covered in either my original video or the response to my video response. So, responseception. Either way, I want to make this my last video on the subject, so everything will be going into this. A few weeks ago I made a video response to Ratchet 5, who is a Spyro the Dragon fan that also happened to personally object to the Spyro Reignited Trilogy that is going to be released in September this year. If there's anybody who doesn't have any interest in the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, then that's absolutely fine. Nobody should have to spend their money on a product that they don't want or disagree with. I would also question you if you decided to buy an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4 just for the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, or any one game for that matter. But it's your money and your right to make that investment. When I originally responded to Ratchet's video, it was because I wanted to provide reasons as to why some consumers may want to experience the Spyro Reignited Trilogy and why its release isn't as offensive as he makes it out to be. There were points in his video where he was making it seem like some kind of massive agenda and almost a personal affront at times. He also performed a song, and I say song as generously as possible, where he sang some of his objections, and that was before he made his more detailed video that I responded to, and bloody hell is this song absolutely cringeworthy to listen to from a composition and production perspective. It certainly isn't Band-Aid level quality when it comes to raising awareness about actual real world issues, but seriously, go and listen to it as it's unintentionally hilarious. So Ratchet made a response to my video, going over some of the points that I made, and I actually liked his response, and that shows in the likes to dislike ratio in comparison to his previous videos on the subject. There are parts I still disagree with, but his video was much more thought out this time around. I could also sympathise more with his views, as I get why he would want a whole new Spyro experience over a remake. He's been a Spyro fan for years and has stuck by the franchise, probably played many of the games an uncountable amount of times, but has been burnt out by how the franchise has been handled. That is completely reasonable. As great as a completely new Spyro game would be, it just isn't happening right now. But it's not impossible, and maybe, just maybe, the Spyro Reignited Trilogy can potentially provide the new Spyro experience that he's after if he is patient enough, and assuming the best case scenario where more games are made for Spyro following this release. And if that does happen, surely the possibility of the Spyro franchise being potentially experienced by a whole new generation of fans, as well as possibly bringing back the general audience that went away after a certain point, is better than how Spyro has been doing over the past few years. Keeping the series to just its hardcore fandom and a select few people sounds like a selfish alternative. And also hoping that the Spyro Reignited Trilogy flops just so it proves the points you make, and also hoping that Spyro remains within its hardcore niche fandom and that nobody else can play it apart from a select few people, just sounds incredibly selfish to me. Spyro should have the opportunity to be allowed to be played by the general audience again and not just by the hardcore fans. Anyway, the Spyro Reignited Trilogy is still 4 months away from being released, and we still don't know that much about it outside of it being a remake of the original Spyro the Dragon trilogy developed by Insomniac Games, and that it's going to be an Unreal Engine 4. Nobody has played it yet outside of Toys for Bob and a couple of testers at the most. The game could be good, the game could be bad, it can go either way. I hope that it's going to be the former, and I'm basing that on how the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy performed, which wasn't perfect and had flaws with its loading times and physics, but it was a decent enough experience for what it was and got me back into those games for the first time since Crash Bash. I still haven't pre-ordered the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, and that's because I want to find out more information about it before I give my money to Activision and Toys for Bob. I also want to definitely make sure that there aren't any anti-consumer business practices that get added to this release. I didn't pre-order the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy until 2 weeks before its release, and by that time I was more than happy with what was being advertised, and I will likely do the same thing for the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. In Ratchet's original video and his response to my video, there are a few more points I wish to cover before I address the actual topic. Firstly, Ratchet said about how people misunderstood him when he said about consoles being bad and how he only meant modern consoles being bad. That was not clear in any way, which is why I made a point about it in my video, and other people questioned this as well. If he had said that modern consoles are crap, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, as that would have been much clearer. People call me out all the time if I make a point that they cannot understand, and don't be surprised when people call you out on it to explain it more. Secondly, Ratchet was not a fan of how I critiqued the length of his video, which was 30 minutes long. Midway through his original video, Ratchet stated that he didn't particularly care, and I said that if he didn't care, he wouldn't have spent half an hour discussing it. He correctly pointed out that my video was 47 minutes long in retaliation, and there's reasons why that occurred. When it comes to video responses, I could either represent the entirety of the original video or heavily edit it. Now, with a video like this, apart from a couple of minutes that were removed, Ratchet had made a lot of points, and because of that, it was going to be very difficult to keep my own video shorter than his. If I had heavily edited it to a more abridged version, people would say I wasn't properly representing him or his original argument, as well as possible accusations of manipulating the footage. I wanted to show people the vast majority of Ratchet's video so that they could personally see what he had to say, and a link to his original video was provided in the video description of my video so people could watch it on its own merits. It's unfortunate that more people didn't watch the original video honestly before watching mine. Thirdly, going back to Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, Ratchet wants a remake of this game because he and some other Spyro fans can see potential that wasn't utilised due to it being a rush release. Now, even if the game does have this untapped potential that nobody but some of the hardcore Spyro fandom had noticed, it is very unlikely that Enter the Dragonfly would ever get a remake, because who, outside of the hardcore Spyro fandom, are demanding an Enter the Dragonfly remake? Companies are also going to look at products that did well with audiences, and if they want to remake certain products, they usually go for the products that resonated with audiences. Why, for example, is Sonic Mania so heavily based on the original Sonic the Hedgehog games instead of Sonic 06? Why was Tomb Raider The Angel of Darkness not chosen over Tomb Raider to be remade for Tomb Raider Anniversary? Why GoldenEye 007 over Tomorrow Never Dies or The World Is Not Enough? Or Pokemon Red and Blue over Pokemon Pinball? Do you see my point? These games got remakes due to their popularity with audiences, the huge impact that they made on the games industry at the time, as well as the possibility to update these games to a more contemporary standard. These remakes also happened to celebrate an anniversary and capitalised on what people liked and remembered about those releases. Going for an Enter the Dragonfly remake is only going to appeal more towards the hardcore fandom, and it has such a bad reputation that could put some people off, and most publishers aren't going to want to take that risk or tell their developers to work on trying to redesign what was originally a poorly realised product for a new generation. They'd rather work with something that was actually considered good. Finally, Ratchet stated that he's a cynical old man in one of his comments to me. Now, this is slightly hilarious, as I'm pretty sure I'm older than Ratchet by at least a couple of years, so if he's old, then I'm definitely old. I turned 26 this year, and Ratchet is at least 1 or 2 years younger than me from what I can remember. I joke about being old or feeling old quite a lot, but people can tell I'm not being serious. I get the impression that Ratchet wasn't actually joking when he said this. Being in your early to mid-20s does not mean that you are old, unless you lived in medieval times where life expectancies were much shorter. So unless you're planning to join the likes of Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse in the 27 Club anytime soon, just lighten up a tiny bit. Moving on to the main reason why I wanted to make this video, and it's all about Activision and how I supposedly defend them. We know that Ratchet does not like Activision in relation to what they are doing with the Spyro the Dragon IP and the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. We know that he has huge grievances with Activision with how they have sat on the Spyro IP for a decade and not done anything noteworthy with him outside of Skylanders until now. We also know that anyone who doesn't mind any particular aspect of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy or its direction is a normie and or a cuck. Ratchet has declared on multiple occasions through YouTube comments that I am an Activision defender. Just to double check, is that the Activision equivalent of being a part of the Avengers or the Justice League? Activision Defender is such a crap name. Can I at least be called an Activision Executioner instead? If I'm going to be affiliated as some kind of Activision fan, then I should at least be able to choose the title I have. I am not an Activision defender, and I want to go on record as stating that anything levelled at me along those lines is completely and utterly untrue, and also slightly hilarious. I am not an Activision fan and disagree with them as a publisher with how they handle things, particularly when they make a decision which is completely and utterly anti-consumer or unethical in the manner that EA often does. I view Activision and EA in a similar way, but I'll stick with Activision for simplicity's sake. Activision publish good games, they also publish bad games. Their brand is everywhere due to how many developers that work for them, as well as how many IPs they ultimately own, and that they have the rights to. Activision has acquired a good chunk of the games industry so that it's difficult for anyone else to get in on the action. It is very difficult to buy a game without Activision having financed that particular game and its developer first, so unless you swear off buying any products that they have published, and good luck if you try and do that, same goes for EA incidentally, then you'll miss out on at least a few good games regardless of how poorly Activision treat their consumers, as well as how they treat their developers and their IPs with contempt, particularly if they start to not succeed. Look at games such as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and Guitar Hero. Remember how popular they once were? Well, they're not anymore, simply because those games progressively got worse over time and Activision completely killed off those series and several development teams in the process, instead of trying to commission a new developer who understands those particular series. Activision will completely destroy what's left of those products when they start to perform badly, so that they can keep the money coming in from their other commissioned developers and their products. Their big money makers at the moment are Call of Duty and Destiny. If they ever start performing below expectations, you can bet that Activision will eventually drop them and move on to the next big hit under them. I have already talked about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD and why that was such a crap game and why Activision completely killed the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series through that game, so I'm not going to go into that too much here because I talked about it on my previous Crash and Spyro video. But Activision was responsible for its final fate, and that those games were left in the hands of an inexperienced development team. The GoldenEye 007 remake was an alright game, but it was mediocre compared to the original GoldenEye 007, which completely revolutionised the idea of playing a first-person shooter on consoles, and it also gave one film at least one good video game tie-in that stood up well on its own merits. There are a few good movie tie-in games, but it's not very common. Activision could have, and they should have, done so much more to make a GoldenEye 007 remake much more worthwhile, particularly when it came to negotiating the complex rights situation that James Bond has. GoldenEye Source, as a fan-made game, does a much better job of recreating GoldenEye 007 and the charms it had better than Reloaded ever did. Later on, they completely killed the James Bond games after 007 Legends, and Eurocom remained defunct shortly afterwards, which is a shame because they had been a consistent developer for many years, until that point. Do you still think I'm an Activision defender after all of that? If you dislike Activision as a company because of how anti-consumer they are and how they treat developers and their series, then that's fine. But if you only dislike Activision just because of how they've collaborated with Toys for Bob on Spyro the Bloody Dragon, then that's nothing in comparison, because so far I can't see much in the way of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy where the usual Activision problems have occurred, and I can't see their usual business practices seeking its way into this game either until they decide to confirm something. Dislike Activision solely for their whole body of work and how they operate on a grand scale and not just on one series, which in comparison isn't actually as bad or as monumental as what they have done elsewhere. Now, on two separate occasions, both on my original response video and Ratchet's response, he declared that I was an Activision defender because of the way I critiqued his original video, where the vast majority of his arguments were based around Activision as opposed to Toys for Bob, because we still don't know how much say Activision actually had in the development of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. They may not have cared, they may have just let Toys for Bob do the entire thing on their own without dictating what they had to do. And if that's the case, then any of the grievances that Ratchet has could be directed towards Toys for Bob instead. But again, we don't know until more information gets released. It could be that Activision completely dictated how Toys for Bob were going to work with the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. We don't actually know yet. All I'm guessing so far is Activision told Toys for Bob, you have to make a remake of the original Spyro trilogy and we're going to finance it. That's all I'm guessing so far, but I could be wrong. Annoyingly, despite the 2 occasions where I responded to Ratchet and stated my more detailed views on Activision as a company, including what I have mentioned here, he somehow still thinks I'm empathetic towards Activision as a company and that I'm giving them a free pass, so he calls me an Activision defender. I'm trying to be as balanced as I can, and whilst I don't like Activision, I can at least look into why they do certain things the way they do, and that doesn't mean I endorse their behaviour in any way. And I ask this question again, do you dislike Activision because of how they operate as a company, or solely because of how they are handling Spyro? If it's the latter, then you need to get a much wider perspective on them as an organisation, because in comparison, Spyro the Dragon is minor compared to some of the other stuff that Activision have done over the years. Even other people have also said I'm not an Activision defender. Ratchet called me ignorant in his video response, and he also called me snide and condescending via some of his comments, as well as stating that my video was crude. My original video, that is. I'll let you decide if these terms can also be applied to him. There have been multiple times in the comment section of my video where I have stood up for Ratchet when people have said things that I know to be completely untrue things about him. There have been people who have said that Ratchet isn't a true Spyro fan for disliking the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, and those people are wrong. There's plenty of evidence to show that he is a Spyro fan, and he is entitled to dislike the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, even if I disagree with him. I certainly don't approve of the personal attacks people have made against him in the comment section. You can agree or disagree with his points without going down to that level, and that was what I was trying to avoid in my original video. So because I haven't been critical of Activision in relation to their recent treatment of Spyro, that is presumably why I'm mainly being called an Activision defender. If you can prove I endorse Activision outside of Crash and Spyro, go for it, but you'll be wasting your time. But how Activision have treated Crash or Spyro so far is nothing compared to some of the other crap that they have done in the industry with completely different developers and completely different series. Any damage that did occur with Crash and Spyro was happening before Activision bought the sole rights to those franchises. When they did have the sole rights, they waited instead of acted for various reasons, simply because there's plenty of evidence that Crash and Spyro got ran into the ground with annual releases which were mostly mediocre or pretty bad in some cases, and I talked about that in my previous video. Does it suck that Activision own Crash and Spyro? Of course it does. There are tons of other publishers who would benefit from owning the rights to these characters. They would give them the attention and treatment they deserve and understand why these characters are so appealing to people more than Activision currently does. But unfortunately, this is how things have ended up. It's like Bethesda with Fallout or Disney with Star Wars. You can disagree with the creative choices that these companies have made with those franchises, but it's difficult to experience any new products going forward without their names on those products, until they get bought out naturally. Now if Activision do end up not doing anything with Crash or Spyro further after their trilogy remakes, then they only have themselves to blame for not living up to the potential that's being established, and then the current criticisms that Ratchet has made make more sense. If Activision choose not to do anything else beyond the remakes, then I would hope that they would sell the rights to a publisher who does want to do something with them, but I find it highly unlikely for Activision to ever be that thoughtful in the name of artistic integrity. Seeing as Ratchet dislikes Activision, whether it's because of how they operate as a company or just with how they treat Spyro, I decided to look at Ratchet's channel again. Through his playlist section, I can count at least 3 games he has played that tie into Activision in some way, and a further 4th one that doesn't have a playlist but is on his channel. Activision published the Nintendo 64 version of A Bug's Life. They published The Lion King Simba's Mighty Adventure, which is a pretty crap game compared to the original Lion King game that I played on this channel and as a kid. And I actually still have my copy of The Lion King Simba's Mighty Adventure lying around somewhere. Then there's also Toy Story Racer and The Legend of Spyro, Dawn of the Dragon, in specific parts of the world. And guess what? They too have been published by, you guessed it, Activision. So going by this, are you not an Activision defender too because you've covered games that have potentially been published by Activision or have been published by Activision? If you disliked Activision solely as a company and not just in relation to Spyro, surely you would never have touched these games. The Legend of Spyro, Dawn of the Dragon being on there is equally interesting to see, seeing as that's around the time Activision bought the rights to the Spyro IP. I'm really not an Activision defender, just somebody who plays games and hopefully enjoys them, even if that means Activision's name is on them, because I know that ultimately the developer did the most work on the game and not the publisher, aside from financing the development and making specific requests during development. If it turns out that the Spyro Reignited Trilogy ends up being completely unplayable with a whole bunch of microtransactions to unlock all of the old cheat codes or even the games themselves after buying a copy of the game, and you need loot boxes to rescue the dragons, to pick up orbs or hatch dragon eggs, then I won't be supporting Activision or Toys for Bob. But it's unlikely that all of those things will happen, and I hope I can buy another game that I can enjoy. Whether or not you're buying the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, it's up to everyone what they want to buy and support. You are perfectly entitled to not purchase a product you don't want, but don't make it out as if it's going to completely destroy an entire franchise or cause a great deal of distress to people. I'm done with this. I really don't want to have to make another video on this subject, and I want this to be my final word on it. I don't dislike Ratchet 5, but I do think he needs to understand that not everyone is going to feel as extreme as he does towards the game, even if they also have issues with its release. But what do I know? I only decided to go and respond to the person who pretended that they died a few years ago and has an entire playlist dedicated to it. Prank or not, that is a pretty shitty thing to do to your subscribers who care about you, and that shows the maturity level that's on display. If you had any personal integrity, or they really were a result of a hacking incident, then you would remove those videos from your channel. Anyway, that's all I have to say, and hopefully I never have to say anything else beyond this point. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.